Arthur Labinjo-Hughes. There was a quiet suburban home where a new relationship was forming. Arthur's father, Thomas Hughes, had recently moved in with Emma Tustin, a woman he met online, someone he believed offered a fresh start. For Arthur, 6 years old, that fresh start meant leaving behind everything familiar and entering a house where the rules, the tone, and the treatment would slowly begin to shift in ways no one outside those walls could see. At first, the messages between Emma and Thomas sounded like any tense, blended family adjustment complaints about behavior, stress, tough love. But as days turned into weeks, Emma's tone hardened. Friends would later say she seemed irritated by Arthur's presence, viewing him less as a child and more as an obstacle. That frustration seeped into the home, into the daily routines, into the way Arthur was spoken to and treated. Little by little, the warmth disappeared, replaced by cold instructions, timeouts that lasted hours, and a growing distance between the boy and the adults responsible for him. CCTV inside the property would eventually reveal moments the public struggled to forget. Arthur forced to stand for long stretches, isolated behind doors, crying that he was hungry and tired. It wasn't one moment. It was a pattern, a slow tightening of control. Those recordings became silent witnesses to escalating emotional pressure, small cruelties stitched into daily life, each one chipping away at a child who still told his father he loved him. In the days before Arthur collapsed, messages between Emma and Thomas grew darker. Complaints turned into accusations, minor misbehavior described as deliberate attacks, childish frustration treated as rebellion. The home became a place of tension, where Arthur spent more time alone than with anyone willing to comfort him. The CCTV timeline showed him weakened, subdued, and quieter than before. Neighbors overheard raised voices. Relatives tried to raise concerns, but lockdown restrictions and limited access meant the warnings never turned into interventions strong enough to remove him from danger. Then came the afternoon everything broke. A frantic emergency call from Emma's house reported that Arthur was unresponsive. Paramedics arrived to find him limp, gravely injured, and showing signs they could not immediately explain. He was rushed to the hospital, where doctors worked urgently, battling injuries far more severe than anything consistent with a simple fall or accident. Staff would later recall how Emma's version of events didn't align with what they were seeing. A story of a sudden collapse that didn't match the trauma evident on the child's body. Arthur's father arrived at the hospital terrified and confused. Emma repeated her explanation, insisting Arthur had simply hit his head. But frontline doctors grew uneasy. The medical team, experienced in emergency pediatric care, recognized that the injuries were extensive and required significant force. Within hours, the case moved from medical inquiry to criminal suspicion. As police began documenting the scene and gathering statements, inconsistencies surfaced immediately. The timeline didn't fit. The severity of the injuries didn't match Emma's account. The CCTV clips, the neighbors' comments, the relatives' concerns, all of it began converging into a picture no one wanted to believe. And as detectives reviewed the first batch of footage and medical reports, one realization became impossible to ignore. Arthur's final hours did not reflect the story Emma Tustin was telling. And the truth, once uncovered, would shock an entire nation. Emma Tustin, United Kingdom, 2021. Digital evidence, forensic timing, courtroom unraveling. The deeper detectives dug into Emma Tustin's account, the more the facade collapsed. What she initially described as a sudden fall became impossible to reconcile with the evidence emerging from the home, and even more damning, with the digital trail she had left behind. Arthur's final days were not lost in memory. They were recorded, saved, and time-stamped. The first breakthrough came from Emma's own phone. Investigators uncovered audio clips she had recorded of Arthur crying, begging for comfort, whispering that no one loved him. The recordings weren't hidden by mistake, they appeared deliberate. Sent between Emma and Arthur's father, Thomas Hughes, as proof of the problem she claimed Arthur was becoming. The tone was chilling. Not a mother trying to help a struggling child, but an adult documenting distress as if gathering ammunition. Text messages revealed the emotional climate inside the house. Exchanges between Emma and Thomas showed irritation, escalating into hostility. Messages mocking Arthur, dismissing his pain, framing ordinary childhood behavior as malicious defiance. Prosecutors later described these messages as a window into a home where cruelty was normalized and empathy had slowly evaporated. Then came the most devastating evidence, the CCTV timeline. Detectives watched hours of footage showing Arthur standing alone for prolonged periods, wincing in pain, struggling to lift himself from the floor. One clip showed him barely able to hold a drink. Another recorded his faint cries echoing through the house. There were no signs of a child running, jumping, or playing, nothing supporting Emma's story of a sudden self-inflicted injury. Forensic pathologists testified that Arthur's fatal injuries required force equivalent to a high-speed car crash. The timing didn't match Emma's emergency call. The injuries didn't match a fall from standing height. Medical experts were clear. This was not an accident, not a misstep on the stairs, not a sudden collapse. It was a violent impact, delivered with catastrophic force. In court, jurors listened as doctors described internal trauma, old bruises layered beneath new ones, and patterns consistent with prolonged physical and emotional mistreatment. One pediatric specialist explained that Arthur's final hours would have been marked by increasing pain, exhaustion, and unconsciousness. The courtroom fell silent as those words sank in. When detectives presented Emma's digital activity from the day of the incident, the mask fell off completely. Minutes before Arthur collapsed, she had searched for prices of furniture and browsed online shopping. After the impact that would eventually kill him, she waited before calling emergency services. The prosecution argued that this delay, combined with her browsing history, pointed to indifference and calculation. The jury watched as the prosecution played audio clips, Arthur crying "No one loves me," while Emma remained emotionless at the defendant's table. Public observers described the atmosphere as physically heavy, the kind of silence that follows something too painful to comprehend. When the verdict finally came, it was decisive. Emma Tustin was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 40 years. One of the longest sentences ever handed down to a woman in the United Kingdom. Thomas Hughes received a separate sentence for his role in the cruelty and neglect that enabled the abuse. Outside the courtroom, the nation erupted in outrage. Politicians demanded inquiries. Thousands signed petitions calling for child protection reform. Memorials for Arthur appeared in parks, on pavements, outside schools, teddy bears, candles, handwritten notes from strangers who felt they had failed a child they never met. The public grief was raw, the anger sharper than usual. This wasn't just a crime. It felt like a collective moral wound. Arthur had cried for help in recordings, whispered his own fear into the air, and no system caught him in time. As coverage intensified, one truth resonated across the UK. Arthur's death shattered the illusion that cruelty always leaves visible marks, and it forced a reckoning with how easily a child's suffering can be hidden behind closed doors, even when the cameras are rolling. Savannah Brockhill, United Kingdom, 2020. Background. Warnings. Escalating harm. Final hours. Before her name became known across the United Kingdom, Savannah Brockhill was simply a nightclub security worker from West Yorkshire. Confident, physically imposing, and, according to several who knew her, capable of sudden aggression. When she began a relationship with Frankie Smith, the young mother of Star Hobson, the dynamic of the household changed almost immediately. What began as a whirlwind romance gradually turned into a pattern of dominance and control that drew concern from nearly everyone on the outside looking in. At first, family members tried to be supportive, but they noticed shifts in Frankie's behavior. She became more withdrawn, more defensive, more isolated from the relatives who had helped raise Star. Frankie's own mother and grandmother both voiced discomfort with Brockhill's presence. They described her as forceful, jealous, and eager to take control of Star's routines, despite having no parental experience. Conversations that once flowed easily were now punctuated with tension. Frankie often repeated Brockhill's lines, phrases that didn't sound like her own voice. As months passed, relatives began noticing small injuries on Star, bruises explained away as falls, bumps blamed on clumsiness, marks dismissed as accidents common to toddlers. But the explanations never quite matched the site of the injuries. More than once, relatives took photos. More than once, they called authorities. Concern became worry. Worry became alarm. The UK safeguarding agencies received 5 separate referrals from family members and friends. Some came from tearful phone calls, others from in-person reports. Each time, Brockhill and Frankie presented as defensive but cooperative. framing Star as an energetic toddler prone to mishaps. Social workers noted a clean home, a well-fed child, and caregivers who were outwardly calm. But behind the scenes, relatives claimed Brockhill controlled the narrative, dismissing them as troublemakers and creating distance between Frankie and anyone questioning her. Inside the apartment, Brockhill's influence grew harsher. She regulated Star's movements, her eating, her bedtime, even how she interacted with extended family. She monitored Frankie's messages, reacted with jealousy to friendships, and repeatedly filmed the child in distress. Messages later recovered from Brockhill's phone revealed taunts, mockery, and an unsettling fascination with Star's reactions to discomfort. In one clip, prosecutors later described, Brockhill thrust Star upside down, laughing as the toddler cried. Another showed her threatening violence in a chilling tone that blurred joke and menace. As the year progressed, Star's injuries escalated dramatically. Bruises appeared in clusters, not patterns consistent with normal play. Scrapes became welts. Relatives begged social services to take a closer look, convinced something was deeply wrong. Yet each case check ended the same way. No immediate action taken, concerns noted but not escalated. Even Star's great-grandfather, heartbroken and frustrated, warned that something awful was going to happen if no one intervened. By September 2020, the signs could no longer be ignored. Star no longer moved with the energy of a curious toddler. She looked tired, withdrawn, and fearful. She winced when touched, flinched when voices rose, and struggled with basic movements. Brockhill, meanwhile, maintained a rigid grip on the household narrative, insisting that the toddler was clumsy, defiant, or making trouble. The final days were marked by a rapid decline. Star had visible bruising to her face and legs, and her eating had slowed. Family members begged to see her, but were turned away. Text messages between Brockhill and Frankie that week showed irritation rather than concern, as if Star's pain were an inconvenience rather than a warning. Then came the last day. On the morning of September 22nd, Star appeared lethargic, barely able to stand. CCTV showed her collapsing repeatedly, unable to lift herself, while Brockhill handled her with a cold detachment that prosecutors later described as breathtaking cruelty. The footage captured Star falling to the floor, struggling, while adults moved around her with little urgency. Hours later, Brockhill made a hospital call, her voice controlled, brisk, claiming the toddler had simply fallen off a sofa and hit her head. But when Star arrived at Airedale General Hospital, doctors knew instantly that the story couldn't be true. The severity of her injuries didn't match any minor household accident. The bruising pattern, the internal trauma, the signs of prolonged mistreatment, none aligned with Brockhill's version. And for investigators listening to that first call and watching the tapes, one realization echoed. The truth was far darker than the explanation. The footage, the forensics, the trial, and a nation's reckoning. The truth of what happened inside the West Yorkshire flat did not surface through words. It surfaced through video hours of CCTV that prosecutors later described as a window into cruelty. When detectives seized Brockhill's phone and the home surveillance system she and Frankie Smith had installed, they uncovered footage that froze the courtroom. Clips showed Star Hobson being lifted, dropped, shoved, swung, and handled with a force no toddler could endure. One video showed Brockhill grabbing Star by the arms and spinning her, the toddler's legs dragging along the floor. Another showed her pushing the child to the ground, as if testing how much she could take before collapsing. In one particularly disturbing sequence, Star, barely steady on her feet, staggered and fell. She attempted to get up, only to collapse again, her body already weakened from internal injuries. Brockhill stood nearby, watching, not rushing to help. Prosecutors paused that moment on screen during trial, allowing jurors to absorb the image of a little girl struggling alone, the adults around her unmoved. Doctors who treated Star on the final day testified that her injuries were catastrophic. Severe abdominal trauma, bruising across her limbs and face, and signs of previous harm that had started healing in different patterns. A pediatric pathologist explained that the fatal blow, delivered with severe force, comparable to a car crash impact, could not have come from a fall or playful roughhousing. It was a deliberate assault. Forensic analysis mapped the timeline of harm. Fresh injuries layered over older ones, bruises that had changed color over days. Internal injuries from earlier incidents that Star had survived long enough to endure additional trauma. The physical evidence told a story of repeated abuse. not a singular moment. Then came the text messages. Prosecutors displayed exchanges between Brockhill and Frankie Smith, filled with threats, taunts, and dismissive comments about Star's crying. In one message, Brockhill warned Frankie to sort Star out. In another, she boasted of how she disciplined the child. These messages formed a digital trail that undercut every claim of innocence. When the trial opened at Bradford Crown Court, the nation watched. Coronavirus restrictions limited seating, but the case spread across headlines, outraging millions. The prosecution presented Brockhill as a controlling, violent presence who dominated the household and framed Star as an inconvenience. Frankie, though not the direct killer, was portrayed as passive, intimidated, and increasingly dependent on Brockhill's approval. Witness after witness took the stand, relatives who had raised warnings, social workers who had visited but found the home clean and tidy, experts who reviewed CCTV moment by moment, and doctors who explained the extent of the injuries. The footage became the prosecution's most powerful evidence. Jurors sat silently as video clips played, each showing moments of disregard, bullying, and force that contradicted every excuse Brockhill had offered. During closing arguments, prosecutors described Brockhill's behavior as callous, cruel, and overwhelmingly dominant. They argued that she had inflicted the fatal blow and maintained household control through intimidation. Meanwhile, Frankie Smith faced charges of causing or allowing Star's death. A reminder that neglect can be criminal, even without direct participation. When the verdicts came, the courtroom fell into an uneasy quiet. Savannah Brockhill, guilty of murder. Frankie Smith, guilty of causing or allowing the death of a child. At sentencing, the judge delivered a life term with a minimum of 25 years for Brockhill, later revised to a 35-year minimum due to the brutality and vulnerability involved. Smith received an 8-year term, later increased to 12 following a review that deemed the original sentence too lenient. Outside the courthouse, grief turned to outrage. 5 referrals, 5 opportunities to intervene, 5 chances to save a child. The UK government ordered an immediate safeguarding review. Local agencies faced intense scrutiny. Ministers promised reforms. Public anger echoed across the country as people asked the same question. How did so many see the warning signs, and yet Star still slipped through every gap? Elisa Baker, North Carolina, United States, 2010. The vanishing, the lies, and the first horrifying discovery. Before North Carolina ever knew her name, Zara Claire Baker had already survived more hardship than most adults. Born in Australia, she fought childhood cancer, losing part of her leg and much of her hearing. Yet photos from her early years showed a bright-eyed girl who smiled through surgeries, wore colorful prosthetics, and radiated resilience. When her father, Adam Baker, moved from Australia to the United States with his new wife, Elisa, family friends believed Zara was beginning a fresh chapter, one filled with support and possibility. But behind the walls of the modest Hickory home, concerns began to mount. Neighbors noticed Zara rarely played outside. Teachers reported long absences and unexplained injuries. A school nurse once mentioned bruising. The family wrote it off as accidents, sensitivity, health issues. But the explanations never aligned neatly. Neighbors recalled seeing Zara less and less, sometimes hearing shouting through the walls. A few said they worried she was being kept inside for long periods, though they couldn't prove it. By early autumn 2010, Zara seemed to vanish from view altogether. On a Saturday morning, Adam Baker dialed 911. His voice strained as he reported that both a fire had broken out in their yard overnight, and that a ransom note, supposedly intended for someone else, had been found. But when police asked where Zara was, the answers shifted. Adam said he hadn't seen her since the previous night. Elisa claimed she had seen Zara earlier. Their stories contradicted each other almost immediately. Officers, sensing something deeply wrong, treated the home as a crime scene. Inside, they found signs that someone had attempted to stage events. A handwritten kidnapping note, odd burn patterns in the yard, and no trace of Zara. When investigators tried to pinpoint the last time anyone outside the home had actually seen the girl alive, confusion turned into alarm. Weeks had passed. No teacher, no neighbor, no doctor had seen Zara in far too long. The search effort expanded rapidly. Volunteers combed forests, drainage areas, and abandoned properties. Helicopters scanned large swaths of land. Detectives interviewed relatives across 2 continents. And as more inconsistencies emerged in both Elisa's and Adam's statements, suspicion zeroed in on the stepmother, who seemed to orbit every unanswered question. Physical evidence slowly chipped away at the story Elisa attempted to construct. Items belonging to Zara, a prosthetic leg, clothing, medical supplies, were discarded, in places that made investigators believe there had been an effort to hide or destroy potential clues. Forensic teams recovered traces of Zara in locations linked directly to Elisa, suggesting not an abduction, but a deliberate concealment. The emotional center of the case shifted when officers searching a remote wooded area made a devastating discovery. Human remains, identified as belonging to Zara, scattered across multiple locations. Her body had not been left intact, a detail that investigators withheld from the public initially due to its shocking nature. What they did reveal was enough to break hearts across the world. Zara had been disposed of in pieces, as though her final moments were something to be erased rather than mourned. At a press conference that evening, a lead detective's voice wavered as he described the findings. Reporters said the silence among seasoned officers spoke louder than the words. The community, already shaken, now faced the unbearable truth that Zara's disappearance was not a tragic accident, not a kidnapping gone wrong, but something far more deliberate and far more cruel. And as investigators returned to confront Elisa Baker with the evidence, one question remained hanging in the air. What happened to Zara inside that house, and how far would Elisa go to hide it? Confession, charges, and a global outcry for Zara. The discovery of Zara Baker's scattered remains shattered every lie Elisa Baker had clung to. The moment detectives confronted her with the forensic findings, Zara's prosthetic leg recovered in one location, bone fragments in another, the carefully rehearsed story of kidnappers, ransom notes, and accidents finally collapsed. The investigation had reached a turning point, and Elisa could no longer hide behind conflicting timelines or fabricated threats. During questioning, Elisa broke her silence in a way that stunned even seasoned investigators. She admitted to helping dispose of Zara's body, describing how she and Adam had panicked after the girl died. She claimed Zara had passed away during an illness, insisting there had been no intent to harm her. Prosecutors immediately challenged the narrative. Her explanation did not match the medical findings, the scattered remains, or the evidence of prolonged mistreatment. And more crucially, it did not explain why a child's body would be dismembered and hidden in remote sites across Catawba County. Under mounting pressure, Elisa signed a handwritten statement admitting to dismembering Zara's remains and discarding them across multiple locations. She tried to place blame on others, shifting responsibility between herself and Adam. But investigators noted that the disposal sites were tied to Elisa's movements, not his. Her confession, while incomplete and self-serving, confirmed what the world already suspected. Zara had not died in an accident. She had been discarded by the very adult meant to protect her. The charges began to stack quickly. Elisa Baker was charged with second-degree murder, a charge prosecutors said reflected Zara's vulnerable condition, the history of neglect, and the deliberate attempt to conceal the child's death. She also faced counts of obstruction of justice for writing the fake ransom note, bigamy for being legally married to another man while living with Adam, and multiple drug-related offenses discovered during the investigation. The breadth of charges illustrated how deeply her life was entangled with deception and criminality long before Zara disappeared. At sentencing, prosecutors laid out the physical and emotional evidence with devastating clarity. Zara's malnutrition, the signs of long-term abuse, the forged documents, the calculated disposal of her remains. Elisa's defense argued she suffered from addiction, mental instability, and fear of Adam. But the court found her explanations insufficient to erase her responsibility. In 2012, Elisa Baker was sentenced to 15 to 18 years for the murder of Zara, plus additional time for obstruction and other charges. Though some members of the public believed the sentence should have been harsher, the judge emphasized that the evidence supported the charge agreed upon in the plea deal, and that Elisa would serve consecutive terms for the additional crimes. Attention then shifted to Adam Baker. Zara's father was not charged with murder. However, prosecutors publicly questioned his judgment, his failure to protect his daughter, and his role in allowing Elisa to isolate Zara from the outside world. Adam was eventually convicted on lesser charges, including obstruction related to the fake ransom note, but he avoided any charges directly tied to Zara's death. For many, that outcome raised uncomfortable debates. Where does negligence end and responsibility begin? As the case unfolded, global media spotlighted Zara's life, not just her tragic end. News outlets in Australia and the United States shared photos of Zara smiling bravely through cancer treatments, wearing bright wigs and playful clothes. Known in her hometown as the little girl who always hugged her classmates, candlelight vigils were held across 2 continents. A memorial garden was planted in her honor. Schools led campaigns for stronger child welfare checks, inspired by the hope that another child with Zara's gentle spirit would never slip through unnoticed again. Even years later, visitors continued to leave flowers at the sites where her remains were found. A simple teddy bear, a handwritten note, a painted rock with her name, small offerings that speak to a collective promise. Zara will never be forgotten, and her story will remain a warning about the consequences of ignoring the quiet suffering of a child hidden behind closed doors. Louise Porton, United Kingdom, 2018. 2 daughters, 2 medical emergencies, and a digital trail that exposed the truth. Before the courtroom, before the headlines, before the public searched for words strong enough to describe what happened, there was a young mother in a small Warwickshire flat, raising 2 daughters who adored her. 3-year-old Lexi Draper and 17-month-old Scarlett Vaughan were lively toddlers, affectionate, curious, inseparable. Neighbors remembered their laughter drifting through thin apartment walls. But behind closed doors, their mother, Louise Porton, seemed to be living a life increasingly disconnected from theirs. Louise was in her early 20s, active on dating apps and social media, trying to cultivate an image of glamour and freedom. To acquaintances, she appeared overwhelmed, juggling childcare alone. But phone logs later revealed something else entirely. Hundreds of messages to men, late-night conversations, hours spent taking photos, videos, and making online plans, all while she complained publicly about the burden of motherhood. Prosecutors would eventually argue that she saw her daughters not as family, but as obstacles standing between her and the life she believed she deserved. Concerns had circulated quietly for months. A relative mentioned that Louise often relied on others to watch the girls, vanishing for stretches of time. Friends noticed she seemed irritated by normal toddler behavior. One recalled her snapping, "I just need time for myself." Her digital footprint reflected the same sentiment. Searches for modeling opportunities, conversations about meeting new men, posts about wanting to relax, party, and earn fast money, all while Lexi and Scarlett clung to her for attention. Then came the first emergency. In early January 2018, Louise called paramedics after reporting that Lexi had suddenly stopped breathing. The medical report recorded blood traces around the child's nose and mouth, details that didn't quite align with Louise's calm explanation that Lexi had just gone quiet. Doctors attempted to revive her, but the toddler was pronounced dead at the hospital. Louise's demeanor unsettled staff. She appeared composed, almost detached. While others cried for the little girl, Louise used her phone to respond to messages from men. Not long after leaving the hospital, she updated photos on her social apps. Investigators made notes, but with no conclusive cause of death, the case remained open but unresolved. Lexi's passing, at that stage, was treated as a tragedy. Weeks later, the second emergency call came. In late January, emergency services rushed to Louise's home again, this time for Scarlett. Louise claimed the toddler had suddenly fallen ill in the car. By the time paramedics arrived, Scarlett was limp. Rescuers fought to save her, but the similarities to Lexi's collapse were unmistakable. Another daughter gone, less than 1 month after the first. This time, police looked harder. Patterns emerged quickly. 2 healthy toddlers dying suddenly, weeks apart. Both collapses occurring while alone with their mother. Digital activity showing Louise online chatting and browsing moments before and after each child's collapse. And then, investigators found the search history. On Louise's phone were queries that struck detectives as chilling. Can you kill someone with blocked airways? How long does it take for a baby to die? Symptoms of airway obstruction, combined with the medical inconsistencies. These searches shifted the case from tragedy to suspicion. Police examined CCTV from public areas near Louise's home and car parks. Footage showed her moving with mechanical calm, placing Scarlett into the vehicle on the day she died. Her demeanor betraying no urgency until she made the emergency call. Witnesses recalled unsettling comments Louise made that she needed space, that she didn't want the responsibility, that the girls were in the way. One man told police she had sent pictures of herself the night Lexi died, minutes after leaving the hospital. By February, the investigative team believed they were closing in on the truth. The deaths were no longer isolated events. They were sequential, patterned, intentional. And as detectives prepared their forensic reports, one detail hardened the case. Phone logs showing Louise scrolling through messages and taking selfies while her daughters lay dying evidence that would later collapse any claim of innocence. With the medical experts ready to testify, and the digital trail now fully mapped, officers moved toward an arrest, knowing what the world would soon learn. Two little girls had not been lost to chance but to a mother's chilling indifference and deliberate acts. Forensics, digital evidence, and a jury that needed only one story to decide. By the time forensic specialists entered the case formally, the pattern was already hauntingly clear. Two healthy toddlers, dead within 1 month of each other, both collapsing only when alone with their mother, and both leaving behind medical clues that whispered the same possibility: deliberate obstruction of their airways. But suspicion is not proof. The prosecution needed a story built on science, timing, and technology. And in the case of Louise Porton, the evidence did not whisper for long. It shouted. The pathologists were the first to shift the investigation from uncertainty to certainty. With Lexi, the older daughter, the signs were subtle but undeniable. Petechial hemorrhages, faint pressure marks, blood traces around the lips. Nothing matched Louise's calm claims of sudden illness. With Scarlett, the findings painted the same picture except stronger. The child's airway, lungs, and facial bruising aligned far more with compression than with any natural medical event. Two daughters, two sets of indicators, one explanation. Then came the digital forensics, the part of the case that left the courtroom silent. Investigators had extracted weeks of Louise's phone data, and what they found formed the backbone of the prosecution's narrative. Search entries were time-stamped in ways that left no room for misinterpretation. On nights when the girls were struggling to breathe, Louise had been researching variations of ways to kill. Can someone die from blocking nose and mouth? How long does it take? And other phrases. Investigators read carefully, but soberly. Prosecutors never sensationalized these searches. They didn't need to. The stark contrast between the content of the searches and the tender ages of the victims spoke entirely for itself. Even more telling were the minutes around each emergency call. Logs showed that before phoning paramedics, Louise had continued text conversations with multiple men, sent selfies, browsed online modeling opportunities, and responded to casual chats, all while claiming that her daughters had just collapsed moments earlier. One juror later described the evidence as a timeline that convicted itself. In court, the prosecution walked the panel through both deaths carefully, always using measured language. Their aim wasn't spectacle, it was clarity. They showed how Lexi's death had been ruled unascertained, but that with Scarlett's eerily similar collapse, the medical likelihood shifted dramatically. Experts explained how certain airflow patterns, bruising types, and internal findings aligned with manual obstruction. No gore, no theatrics, just science. The defense suggested stress, exhaustion, and sudden illness. They spoke of Louise's overwhelming circumstances, of her struggle as a single mother, but the digital records made those explanations feel thin. Every time they pointed to maternal overwhelm, the prosecution countered with a time-stamped message Louise had sent to a man minutes before her daughter died. By the closing arguments, the digital timeline, medical testimony, and Louise's own words had created a narrative the jury could not ignore. Deliberations were swift. When the verdict returned, guilty of 2 counts of murder, Louise stood almost motionless, as though waiting for someone else's sentence. The judge called her actions calculated and cruel, imposing a life sentence with a minimum of 32 years before she could even be considered for release. Outside the courtroom, a wave of public grief and fury spread across the United Kingdom. Commentators questioned how 2 children could die weeks apart without earlier intervention. Advocates demanded stronger social care systems, better follow-up after unexplained pediatric deaths, and deeper oversight of families flagged multiple times by concerned relatives. But the heaviest response came from ordinary citizens, parents, grandparents, siblings, who could not reconcile the images of Lexi and Scarlett with the digital logs that revealed their mother's indifference. The public saw two toddlers who should have been laughing, learning, growing, instead reduced to entries on a forensic timetable. And as the country absorbed the verdict, one truth lingered with chilling clarity. It wasn't just the science that convicted Louise Porton. It was the story her own phone told, a story of absence, neglect, and deliberate harm that no jury could look away from. Inside the house where loyalty was forced, fear was cultivated, and escape became the only truth. Before police ever stepped inside the Notek property in Raymond, Washington, long before prosecutors tried to explain the atmosphere inside that house, one thing was already clear to anyone who had ever visited. Nothing in that home moved without Shelley's permission. She controlled the flow of conversation, the daily routines, and even the emotional tone of the household. People obeyed Shelley Notek the way others obey alarms, automatically, instinctively, and with dread of what might happen if they didn't. Shelley described herself as a mother trying her best, but those who lived under her roof, her daughters, her stepchildren, and the vulnerable adults she took in, later described something closer to a private dictatorship. Stepchildren reported being isolated from one another, their friendships monitored, their movements heavily restricted. Compliments were given sparingly, but punishments came unpredictably, and with a level of psychological pressure that left the victims doubting their own memories. Shelley's control operated on several layers. First came the charm, the affectionate nicknames, the warm promises of safety, the insistence that only family matters. But once someone was inside her orbit, the rules shifted. Instructions became commands. Commands became obligations. And obligations quickly became tests of loyalty that no one could ever pass. Anyone who questioned Shelley found themselves facing bizarre punishments disguised as tough love, ranging from forced labor to intentional humiliation. Those who resisted were isolated until their world narrowed entirely to Shelley's approval. When Shelley began inviting vulnerable adults into her home, friends down on their luck, people estranged from their own families, individuals seeking stability, the dynamic intensified. These adults were treated not as guests, but as extensions of Shelley's control. Survivors later recounted days filled with manipulation, gaslighting, and threats disguised as motherly warnings. Some victims were instructed to perform degrading tasks. Others were denied basic necessities unless they showed gratitude. Bit by bit, their sense of independence faded. And then came the disappearances. When one adult mysteriously vanished from the home, Shelley provided elaborate explanations. They had run off. They had gotten into trouble elsewhere. They had chosen to cut ties. When another disappeared, she repeated similar stories. Inside the house, questioning these narratives was dangerous. Shelley's daughters remembered being instructed to continue behaving as though these missing individuals were simply away. Meanwhile, Shelley maintained an iron grip on their fear, rewarding silence and punishing curiosity. What made Shelley particularly dangerous was not just the physical harm she inflicted, but the psychological web she spun. She convinced some victims that the outside world was more threatening than anything happening inside the house, making escape seem futile. She framed herself as both the cause of suffering and the supposed savior from it. This contradiction kept many victims trapped far longer than outsiders ever realized. But all coercive systems eventually crack, usually at the point where someone, somewhere, finally stops believing the lies. For the Notek family, that moment came when one victim managed to slip out long enough to confide in someone who would listen. The details were fragmented, frightened, and halting but unmistakably alarming. A story of forced labor. A story of threats. A story of people who had vanished. A story of a stepmother who punished through isolation and reward cycles so intense they felt like brainwashing. Authorities initially met the report with caution. It was difficult to separate trauma from testimony. But then multiple accounts surfaced. Former residents, estranged relatives, even Shelley's own daughters, now old enough to speak clearly, stepped forward. Their stories aligned in disturbing ways. The long hours of forced chores, the psychological torment, the fear that dominated every corner of the house, and the unspoken terror of what might happen if they ever tried to leave. By the time detectives arrived at the property, armed with fresh statements and renewed urgency, the stage was set for one of Washington's most shocking criminal investigations. Their discoveries, both inside the house and buried in the testimonies that followed, would reveal years of cruelty disguised as motherhood, loyalty twisted into obedience, and a household where love was weaponized to guarantee silence. And the cliffhanger that shattered everything: the victim who escaped did not just run from the house, they ran directly into a police station, naming Shelley Notek, describing the disappearances, and setting off the investigation that would unravel one of the most disturbing mother-figure abuse cases in modern American history. Shelley Notek, Washington, United States, 1990s, 2000s. The trial that finally broke the silence, and the shadows that still follow her. When investigators finally took the statements from the victim who escaped Shelley Notek's home, they realized they weren't dealing with isolated discipline or family conflict. They were staring at a pattern of coercive control and escalating cruelty that had stretched across years, hidden behind the facade of a chaotic but loving household. Detectives began interviewing former residents, relatives, and Shelley's own daughters, and the stories began aligning like pieces of a grim mosaic. Each account filled in a corner of the timeline that Shelley had spent decades bending to her advantage. Witness after witness described a household where basic needs were weaponized. Food was withheld, rest was conditional, and affection was rationed in tiny doses meant to ensure compliance. Those who lived with Shelley spoke of a constant atmosphere of fear, the kind that doesn't always leave visible marks, but erodes a person's sense of autonomy. Her stepchildren recalled being forced into exhausting tasks, punished unpredictably, and isolated from friends and extended family. Adult victims described being manipulated into believing they owed Shelley gratitude for taking them in, even as she slowly dismantled their independence. But it was the stories surrounding the victims who had disappeared that transformed the investigation. One witness described how a dependent adult had stopped showing up for meals, then for chores, then vanished entirely. Shelley provided a rotating list of explanations. They had moved, they had traveled, they had gotten into trouble and didn't want contact. The explanations were always just vague enough to avoid scrutiny, until detectives started comparing notes. Those who still feared Shelley hesitated, but those who had finally broken free spoke with raw clarity. Their descriptions matched. The punishments, the isolation, the sudden absence of people who had once been part of the household, and the pressure to remain silent. When prosecutors assembled the timeline, it became clear that Shelley used manipulation as her primary tool. She controlled money, movement, communication, and emotional stability. Her daughters described how she demanded absolute loyalty, framing any sign of independence as betrayal. Former residents described a steady erosion of their sense of reality, as Shelley rewrote events, denied obvious truths, and manufactured crises to keep everyone emotionally dependent. The most chilling testimony came when witnesses described how Shelley responded to emergencies. Instead of seeking help, she delayed medical treatment, insisted injuries were the victim's fault, and coached others on what to say. It was this pattern, not just cruelty, but obstruction, that prosecutors highlighted as the foundation of the manslaughter charges. In the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Shelley's defense attempted to frame her as a misunderstood mother with a difficult home life, someone whose tough love had been misinterpreted. But the witnesses, now adults with distance and clarity, spoke firmly. They recounted years of threats, forced labor, psychological torment, and the gradual disappearance of those Shelley had taken under her roof. Her daughters' testimonies were especially devastating. They described a childhood defined by shame, secrecy, and the fear that if they spoke out, they would become the next target of their mother's unpredictable rage. One daughter said she had grown up believing suffering was simply the price of belonging to their family, a sentence that left the courtroom silent. The judge, reviewing the years of coercion and destruction, emphasized that while the charges were manslaughter, the emotional and psychological damage extended far beyond a single event. Shelley was sentenced to prison, a decision met with relief from survivors, who believed they might finally be free from the shadow she had cast over their lives. But the story didn't end at sentencing. After serving her term, Shelley Notek was released, and her return to the public drew immediate concern from those who feared she might repeat past patterns. Child welfare advocates and true crime researchers issued warnings, citing her history of manipulation and the absence of remorse. Some of her surviving children expressed deep unease, worried that without the strict structure of prison, old habits would return unchecked. Her case continued to attract media attention. Books documented the harrowing details of life inside her home. Documentaries dissected the psychological dynamics, and journalists revisited the unanswered questions surrounding the people who had vanished during her control. Shelley herself became an unsettling figure, not because of supernatural folklore, but because of the very real, very human capacity for long-term psychological domination. Shelley's victims have tried to rebuild their lives, reclaiming identities that were once swallowed by silence. But her release serves as a reminder that some stories don't end cleanly, they linger, leaving communities to wonder whether the past can truly stay in the past when the person responsible walks free once more. Sandy Jones, Texas, United States, 2005. When neglect became a silent killer, and the calls for help went unheard. Before dawn in a quiet Texas neighborhood, the faint glow from a single bedroom window revealed a child curled under a thin blanket. Her breathing shallow, her skin cool to the touch. The house around her was still too still for a home with a young child inside. Neighbors would later tell investigators they rarely saw the little girl outside, rarely heard laughter, and often noticed blinds drawn in the middle of the day. They assumed the family preferred privacy. They had no idea the silence was hiding a crisis. The blended household had been unsteady from the beginning. Friends described the father as distant and overwhelmed, working long hours, while his partner, Sandy Jones, stepped into the primary caregiver role for his daughter. At first, nothing seemed amiss. She attended school, made casual friendships, and doctors noted manageable medical conditions that required routine attention. But after the mother's absence became permanent, the weight of care shifted entirely onto Sandy, and the child's world began to constrict. Teachers began noticing changes long before authorities did. Missed appointments, untreated symptoms. A child arriving in class lethargic one week, absent the next. Guidance counselors reached out, asking gently whether everything was all right at home. The reply was always the same. The household was going through a hard time, but they were handling it. Yet each month, the signs of neglect grew more visible. Witness statements later revealed a pattern. The stepmother routinely dismissed the child's pain as acting out, rationed medication, or skipped it entirely. When relatives visited, they described the girl as thin, withdrawn, and increasingly frail. One recalled offering to take her to a doctor, only to be rebuffed with an insistence that she was already being seen. But no records matched those claims. No recent appointments existed. The child's worsening condition was being carried quietly, inside that shuttered home. By early summer, the girl's symptoms had become impossible to ignore. Vomiting, severe fatigue, and episodes where she struggled to stand. A neighbor later reported hearing a soft thud one afternoon, followed by a long stretch of silence. When asked about it, Sandy brushed it off as kids being clumsy. But inside, the child was deteriorating at a pace that doctors later described as unmistakably alarming. During the final days before the emergency call, her condition sharply declined. She stopped eating. She could barely lift her head. According to household witnesses, Sandy dismissed repeated pleas for help, insisting the child was just tired or sleeping it off. The father, who was often away for work, later told investigators he believed his daughter was recovering from a flu, relying entirely on Sandy's updates. Those statements would become central to the prosecution. The fatal gap between what he believed and what was actually happening under his roof. The cliffhanger moment came when Sandy finally brought the child to the emergency room, not because she recognized the urgency, prosecutors argued, but because the girl could no longer be roused. ER doctors took one look at her and immediately sounded the alarm. Her condition was far beyond anything that could have developed overnight. Signs of untreated illness, dehydration, and a prolonged medical crisis were clear. In the stark, fluorescent light of the ER, physicians realized the story didn't match the symptoms. She had been declining for far longer, and someone had watched it happen without intervening. And that was the moment everything changed. Doctors alerted police within minutes. What began as a medical emergency turned into a criminal investigation before the child was even moved from the trauma room. Detectives soon arrived, taking notes as medical staff described what they recognized as the unmistakable signs of neglect. Conditions that could have been managed, complications that could have been prevented, and suffering that should never have reached this point. The home was searched, records were pulled, witnesses called, and the question circling through every interview was the same. How many warnings had been ignored, and why? The answers would unravel in the next chapter, as forensic testimony laid bare a timeline the defense could not escape. When doctors spoke, and the timeline of neglect finally revealed the truth, the emergency room had fallen into that tense hush that settles over medical staff when a child's condition defies the explanation offered by a caregiver. Nurses charted vitals with quick, practiced movements. A pediatric specialist stepped back from the exam table, exhaling slowly as she reviewed the scan results. Within minutes, hospital security had cordoned off the hallway. Detectives were called in. The case had shifted from medicine to suspicion. When investigators arrived, the forensic timeline became the core of everything. Doctors testified that the child's condition was not sudden. It reflected days of untreated decline, perhaps longer. Severe dehydration, organ stress, and untreated infections had developed far beyond what a flu or overnight sickness could cause. Medical charts quietly dismantled the story Sandy Jones had given in her initial statement. Detectives followed the timeline backward. They reviewed school attendance, teacher notes, and pediatrician records. There were no recent checkups, no prescriptions filled, no follow-up scheduled. Instead, they found a trail of missed appointments stretching back months. Each one was another chance, lost another moment, where intervention might have changed everything. Forensic specialists also examined the home. What they discovered reinforced the medical findings. Expired medications, empty bottles that had never been refilled. A lack of basic supplies a child with chronic health issues would normally require. Food logs suggesting inconsistent meals. And, most damning of all, statements from household witnesses describing how the child had complained of worsening pain, fatigue, and trouble walking in the days before collapse. As testimony stacked, the timeline grew painfully clear. This was not an overnight tragedy. It was a slow, preventable decline, unfolding in plain view. While the adult tasked with protecting the child did nothing, the prosecution moved with precision. They called ER physicians who explained, in calm clinical language, how the symptoms had developed over time. They brought in forensic pathologists who showed jurors charts and diagrams describing how long the child's organs had been failing. They introduced neighbor interviews, school reports, and digital records showing the gap between what should have happened and what never did. Prosecutors did not need dramatic flair. The facts were devastating enough. The defense attempted to shift blame, arguing that the father shared responsibility and that Sandy Jones had been overwhelmed, confused, or unaware of the seriousness of the child's medical needs. But forensic experts countered this firmly. The child's condition, they said, could not have been misunderstood. It would have been obvious to anyone in the home. The prosecution emphasized that the father was often away, relying entirely on Sandy's assurances. His negligence was real, but the stepmother had been the one physically present as the child deteriorated. The verdict came after only a brief period of jury deliberation. Sandy Jones was convicted on charges related to criminal neglect resulting in the child's death. The father faced separate charges for failure to protect, reflecting the legal view that the responsibility to safeguard a child does not fall on one adult alone. Both sentences drew public reaction, nationwide grief, frustration, and outrage that warnings from teachers and neighbors had not led to earlier intervention. Sentencing hearings were emotional. The judge emphasized the preventable nature of the tragedy, the pattern of inaction, and the profound breach of trust. Community members submitted letters describing the pain felt by those who had raised concerns and watched them go unaddressed. Child advocacy groups gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs and demanding reforms. And reforms did come. The case spurred discussions in Texas about mandatory reporting thresholds, follow-up requirements, and accountability within social service systems when repeated concerns surface about a child's well-being. Training programs were updated. New review processes were introduced. The tragedy became a reference point, a reminder of what happens when warning signs are present but action stalls. In the end, what lingered most was not the courtroom drama, but the haunting realization that so many people had tried to help. Teachers, relatives, neighbors all had raised small red flags that, in hindsight, formed a clear pattern. But without urgent intervention, the pattern became irreversible, and it closes with a single heavy truth. When a child's voice goes unheard, the silence becomes its own kind of evidence, and sometimes it comes too late for anyone to save them. Margaret Schaefer, Ohio, United States, 1980s. A case that forced a state to ask how many warnings it missed. The Schaefer home in rural Ohio looked from the outside like every other modest house on the quiet street, trimmed hedges, a porch light that flicked on each evening, and a mailbox often stuffed with church bulletins and grocery flyers. Neighbors remembered the little girl who lived there as quiet, polite, and eager to please. They also remembered how quickly she learned not to speak unless spoken to. Years later, several would admit they had sensed something was wrong, but the truth unfolded too slowly, and the warning signs slipped through too many hands. Margaret Schaefer entered the family after a whirlwind courtship with the girl's father. Relatives recalled how the energy in the household shifted. Margaret presented herself as strict but organized, a woman determined to bring structure into a home she felt had become too relaxed. At first, no one questioned her methods. The transition from a single father to a blended family is rarely seamless, and early tension was expected. But soon, structure shifted into dominance, and discipline shifted into punishment. The little girl's demeanor changed subtly but steadily. During family gatherings, relatives noticed she flinched at sudden noises. She stayed close to walls, as if trying to take up less space. When asked about small bruises on her arms, Margaret explained them away with casual certainty. She's clumsy. She fell. Kids bump into things. Her tone left no room for follow-up questions. And each time, the father echoed whatever Margaret had already said, as though repeating a script. Over the months, the physical punishments escalated. Relatives described hearing Margaret raise her voice behind closed doors, the tone sharp, clipped, and commanding. They recalled tense dinners where the girl barely touched her food, eyes fixed on her plate. Some family members suspected fear rather than misbehavior was shaping the child's silence. But suspicion, without proof, rarely moves mountains. And in the 1980s, many communities still viewed harsh discipline as a private family matter, even when it no longer resembled discipline at all. Witness accounts gathered later painted a clearer picture. One relative recalled seeing the girl in oversized clothing that seemed chosen to conceal marks. Another described an incident at a holiday gathering where the child recoiled when Margaret reached for her coat. Teachers, too, noticed signs. A sudden drop in school performance, long sleeves worn in warm weather, and a child who hesitated before answering questions about home life. Reports were made, but without obvious injuries or disclosures. Cases were closed with notes about insufficient evidence. Then came the day everything stopped being invisible. Authorities were called to the Schaefer home after a medical emergency. The child was found unresponsive, and despite efforts from paramedics, she could not be revived. The autopsy revealed what years of subtle signs had tried to warn: extensive indicators of prolonged physical abuse, injuries in various stages of healing, malnourishment. Signs that it had not been a single incident, but a pattern, a long, quiet decline brought on by deliberate harm. In the courtroom, forensic specialists testified with clinical restraint, letting the medical facts speak for themselves. Prosecutors framed the case as a tragedy that grew from unchecked authority and a child's inability to speak for herself. Witnesses who once harbored doubts now stepped forward, their testimonies forming a mosaic of missed opportunities. The aunt who saw bruises, the teacher who filed reports, the neighbor who heard shouting, the relative who sensed fear but couldn't prove it. The defense attempted to portray Margaret as overwhelmed, insisting that the child's injuries were accidental and the medical crisis unforeseeable. But the jury did not accept that narrative. The charge was clear. Margaret Schaefer was convicted for her role in the fatal abuse of her stepdaughter, a verdict that carried the weight of everything unspoken in that quiet Ohio home. The sentencing drew widespread attention because it arrived during a period when the United States was beginning to re-examine child protection laws. Advocates cited the Schaefer case in arguments for stronger mandatory reporting, better follow-through by social services, and more rigorous training for educators to identify signs of chronic abuse. It became part of the early foundation for reforms that would later shape national child welfare policies. In the end, the legacy of the case stretched far beyond one trial. It forced a state, and eventually a nation, to confront the uncomfortable truth that danger can hide behind closed doors, even in homes with trimmed hedges and warm porch lights, and that sometimes the difference between noticing and acting is the difference between a child surviving or becoming a statistic in a courthouse file.